Thank you. Wow, what an accurate introduction. I mean, AI is disrupting all the industry. So, yeah, the technology works. Very good morning to all of you, and welcome back after a nice coffee break. It's always great to present after coffee break for many good reasons. So let me quickly introduce the topic I'll be discussing with you in next for next 30 minutes is ransomware in the OT environment. Now, I thought before we move into my core content, it's good to recap a brief history about ransomware for everyone's benefit. So, world witnessed the first ransomware attack in the year 1989 at one of the health conferences in Stockholm. And in that, a guy named Joseph, if my memory goes right, he distributed around 20,000 floppy disks with a malicious document to the researchers in the conference. And the ransomware ask that time was 189 US dollar to be sent via post. No bitcoins those days. Now, ransomware has come a long way since then with more complexity, able to bypass the security solution, and had quite a few success in the past. But there came the year 2017, where again world witnessed a large-scale ransomware attack, and we all know it was WannaCry. A worm-like behavior, first time in the ransomware kind of attack. Post WannaCry, the attacker group with a criminal motivation, they all thought this is a great financial opportunity for all of us to collaborate and do business together. And they started what's called big game hunting. So in the big game hunting, these different attacker groups with different skill set, they are collaborating and collaborating with a revenue sharing model with a very complex and larger goal. So attacker group, some of the attacker groups, they have a skill set to get the access into the environment. Few have skill set to develop a code, the actual malware code. The others, they deliver and execute with a motivation, and they all share the revenue. So it has become more complicated to defend against these ransomware attacks. And then happened Colonial Pipeline, which we're going to discuss today. So with that, let me introduce the agenda. For next 20 plus minutes or so, I'm going to explain you what really happened to Colonial Pipeline during the ransomware attack, how really the ransomware attack happened, what really brought down the whole system, few recommendations, how to mitigate the threats, the attacks within the OT environment. So Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, you might have heard, you might have read, I'm very much sure. But I think not many of you know that what really happened during that ransomware attack, and was that the IT attack or the IT system within the OT environment got attacked, or it was the core pumping system, the oil pumping system, which got impacted. So if you look at what Colonial Pipeline is, the organization, they are the largest gasoline provider to the southeastern American states, and they provide the gas to the homes, to industries, different industry, including the aviation. So yeah, so the business is quite big. It was a good motivation for attackers to bring it down for disruption. So what really happened? This slide is quite important, and I'm going to explain what really happened. So on 7th of May 2021, there was an announcement that the Colonial Pipeline is shutting down, temporarily shutting down the operations. But the attack really started on April or 29th of the April 2021, a week before. So what really happened? Attacker, the adversary group, they actually got a compromised valid credential for the traditional VPN setup without any multi-factor authentication. So there was no multi-factor authentication. Attacker managed to get the compromised password. It was a very traditional setup, and they managed to get inside the system, compromising the VPN. Now, a couple of things to be noted here. Number one, they got the stolen password. So they were able to use that particular stolen password. That means organization was using duplicate password. They were using the same password for another privilege account. Flaw number one, or the misconfiguration, what they did. Second, the authentication was without the multi-factor enabled. So there was no multi-factor enabled for colonial pipeline kind of setup. So yeah, that was flaw number two. The third one is basically to understand that this attack never impacted the core pipeline setup, which is the core gasoline pumping setup, the core OT environment. It actually, the target was the billing system, the IT system. And we will learn today in my session and also the panel discussion that the IT system within the OT environment is an easy access for the adversary group. Then what happened was, the good thing happened, that colonial pipeline people, they were quite aware of their setup, so they quickly cut loose the network temporarily because they wanted to stop the spreading of the attack, and that's where there was a temporary disruption in the whole setup. Within few hours, FBI and other organizations, they really helped to negotiate, and finally they have to pay 75 bitcoins in a ransomware, as a ransomware payment, which was costed that time around $4.4 million. But again, the good thing happened. FBI, very rarely, they managed to get 63 Bitcoin out of 75 back. And that was really cool and good on their part, because, and that says that you need to report the breach for the organization to help you guys. Yeah, so that's on the colonial pipeline attack, what really happened. The adversary group behind the attack was DarkSide, as very well known in the open world. CrowdStrike, we have our own intelligence, and we track these attacker with a financial motivation as a spider group, and the name of this particular group behind colonial attack was Carbon Spider, the guys behind DarkSide. So if you look at their TTP, so Carbon Spider started their operation in 2013 with a key line of business. Their line of business was to compromise and focus on point of sale machine, get the credit card details, and sell in the underground forums. Post that, they also collaborated with another spider group, Pinchy Spider, the group behind Revel ransomware, the Revel malware. And this is where the whole big game hunting started, collaborating with different groups. They made their fortunes. They made a lot of money, impacting many key organizations, including Colonial Pipeline. And in September 2020, they released the Linux version of the ransomware. So to all the people in the room, Linux is relatively safe or secure, but not 100% secure. And in May 2021, they shut down the DarkSide. And thanks again to FBI, when they managed to shut down their infrastructure, managed to get back the 63 Bitcoin, and that actually forced the DarkSide group to shut down their, or forced the Carbon Spider group to shut down their DarkSide. But they are back again. We can have a separate discussion on that. So OT or OT impact or a OT outage is not always because, or I should say, mostly is because of impacting the IT environment. So that's exactly what happened in the Colonial Pipeline attack. And also, if you understand the overall compromise of this OT environment, generally requires the first compromise IT asset. So, you need to think from an attacker point of view. For an attacker, it's a very easy to access or compromise an IT machine and get into an OT environment, because you all know the Purdue level, and I have a slide on that for a recap. But yeah, in the Purdue model, if you see level 5 until level 3.5, it is quite easy for attackers to compromise the machine within those Purdue level. These are the IT machine, those mostly the Windows machine. And that's where they find the first machine to compromise and get an initial access. But always, the point number two is again very important. They collaborate with a trusted insider. Insider threat is really gaining popularity for many reasons. But yeah, so these adversary group, they do a lot of social engineering, but also they manage to get many times, or most of the time, they manage to get the insider, the trusted insider, to compromise with the valid credential and get inside the environment. Now, again, going back to the Purdue level, like I said earlier, rarely it happens that the core network, I know Simon's team is here, but rarely it happens that the core network within the OT environment gets compromised. It's not that easy, because those are the, it's a very customized operating system, customized environment, those PLCs and all the setup. It's not very easy to compromise that. So it's always the IT setup where organization needs the visibility, need to secure to mitigate the risk within the OT environment. And that brings to the IT-OT convergence. And thanks to digitization, it has really brought in a lot of automation to to collaborate the OT with the IT environment, whether it is the reporting, the real-time reporting, the billing system, the IT machines. The IT network is really an enabler. It's a catalyst into the whole OT environment. But that really brings in the vulnerability, because organization needs to focus on the visibility within the OT environment, the IT space, understand those misconfiguration, the vulnerabilities, which can be easily compromised by these adversary groups. So the IT-OT convergence is good, but that brings the responsibility to the security, the cybersecurity team, to get a full visibility around the IT environment and the misconfiguration vulnerabilities in it. Use of a remote access has again gained popularity because of COVID. So post-COVID, people started working remotely. Environments, organization, you have the contractors working remotely. So remote access, the VPN access, has to be really secured. And again, going back to my explanation on what happened in the Colonial Pipeline, so you really need to, or organization really need to invest a lot in securing the remote access within your environment. So it's not conceptual. Last point is again quite important. It has happened in the past. It can happen anytime in future also. So Purdue model, I don't want to spend much time. You guys are quite learned in terms of it, but Purdue model actually explains a concept of segmentation. So if you look at the different Purdue level, right from 5, 4, 3.5, and 3, until here, you have most of the Windows environment, the IT environment, HMIs, which really needs to be secured. You should have first of all, you should have a visibility around your environment, but it has to be secured. You should have a right segmentation at each level. And this was, again, another flaw within the Colonial Pipeline architecture. The segmentation was not very proper. The access were not very proper. So attacker was able to get inside the OT environment, the IT-OT environment, quite easily from the enterprise network. And then comes the core network, which I said, these are quite robust machines, the real-time operating system, those PLCs, the core business logical technology machines. So this is not very easy for attacker to compromise, and they rarely focus on it. See, you need to understand their focus is to disrupt the business, disrupt the whole setup. And it's very easy because of that IT-OT convergence that they focus on IT, disrupt the IT, and they know what happened in Colonial Pipeline, cut loose the IT, and OT will be shut down automatically. So if you look at the kill chain, again, it's quite a easy to understand kill chain, which is very similar how the attack happens within the IT environment. Also starts with the recon. During the recon stage, attacker really try to find the most vulnerable machine, the single machine where they can have or they can get an initial access. After getting an initial access, they try to exploit the vulnerability and they put their payload on the compromised machine, which connects to their network. and using that, they do an exfil, the data exfil. They pivot into the core machines where actual data is, which will have a larger impact, and then they exfil, and finally they achieve their objective. So in Colonial Pipeline also, the data was exfiltrated, around 100 gig, if I'm not wrong, data was exfiltrated, and that was the double extortion technique used by the DarkSide group or the Carbon Spider group. So what we learned in a brief, I was mindful of the time, but I'm quite before the time. But yeah, what we learned until now, the whole OT network, the IT-OT convergence, the collaboration between IT and OT to bring in automation. What happened in the Colonial Pipeline, the weakness within the identity, the whole network, lack of segmentation, using those vulnerable machines, lack of visibility. So what next? I mean, what are some of the recommendations which organizations like you can implement to protect another Colonial Pipeline attack? The first one is quite an interesting one, that the security, the IT security team within the OT environment should have a OT-specific IR plan. Now, unfortunately, I have not seen many organizations have a right IR plan for IT itself, so OT is far away. So I request you all to really go back, discuss with your team, and have an IR plan. You can actually do what I really like organization doing it is the tabletop exercises. The tabletop scenario-based exercise, you can have an exercise based on Colonial Pipeline or any other attack. So you will know, you will gauge a situation that how well your organization is prepared if the attack happens in your environment. That's the IR plan. And in the IR plan, you will have the right people to contact when really the breach happens. So yeah, have handy the IR plan. Implementing the segmentation, the separation of the network within IT-OT environment, very, very important. You heard from the Fortinet guy in the morning on deception, which is again good defense in depth, but the segmentation, I believe, should be the first priority or while designing the whole OT architecture. Gain visibility. Visibility in security is not about OT. You can't protect what you can't see. So visibility in security is very important. Visibility around the network, visibility around the assets, how many assets you have at each Purdue level, how they are contacting or how they are communicating to the other assets, what protocol they are using, how many ports are open. So you need to have the visibility around your OT environment before you start protecting it. And not only visibility around the asset, the second thing is to deploy technology either over the network or at the endpoint to get visibility around the telemetry, get the right telemetry, because telemetry helps to detect the adversarial activity, perform the hunting, and to be on time in detecting the adversarial activity and the attack. So there comes the whole visibility thing, which is quite important in the OT environment. Legacy devices, I mean, you cannot avoid, for many reasons, you cannot avoid the legacy machines within the OT environment. We can take recommendations from the Siemens team, they are here, but yeah, as for my past experience, it's very difficult to avoid, but at least you should have a visibility around how many legacy machines you have, and there are many technologies, the endpoint technologies and the network-based technologies to really mitigate the risk of having legacy machines in your environment. Prioritize identity protection. Again, very important. Going back to what happened in Colonial Pipeline, duplicate credentials being used. Compromise happens, and compromise happens on different platforms. We are humans. We tend to use the same password on multiple platforms. So if, for example, a platform X gets compromised, you are the user, your user is, or the credentials are exposed. Using a social engineering, if attacker finds the user ID of your enterprise network, they try to brute force, and many of time they are successful. So have a right identity protection strategy, protecting the directory sources, Active Directory, having a best practice in terms of your privilege account, deploy PAM, have a multi-factor authentication. So the identity protection, again, is quite an important aspect within the OT environment security. Know your adversary. Again, you can't protect or you can't fight against someone whom you don't know well, their TTPs, their tools they use, how they attack, why they attack, their motivation. So you need to know your adversary. SOC team should have a clear mapping of the potential adversaries in your environment. In the next slide, I'll tell you how CrowdStrike is helping organization to map those adversary. But yeah, you should know your adversary before you design your mitigation strategy. Information sharing, again, is quite important. Why I was able to explain, or why you all know what happened in Colonial Pipeline, because the information was shared. So information should shared among your organization employees, I mean the relevant stakeholder, but also it should be shared for larger benefit with the community, for them not to repeat those mistakes and not to have another attack of similar kind. So with this, like I promised, I'll share with you something, how we are helping communities. So this is the website you all can go to, and you can start mapping your potential adversaries. CrowdStrike, we track precisely 230 adversary groups with different motivation, state-sponsored, criminal, hacktivists. So you can filter based on your country, your industry, your line of business, filter, get the adversary details, their TTPs, and like I said, as a daily operation, please have a mapping so that next time when you are presenting something to your management that why you need this mitigation strategy, you have a right way to present, because you can challenge them that there are adversaries in the OT environment and their TTPs are, or these are the TTPs, and this is the right strategy to mitigate the risk. Final slide. The quote is quite, I love this quote, that says that you can only solve the problem when you understand the problem. Quite logical. I mean, you need to really understand, first of all, your problem to have a right solution. So with that, I want to rest my case, and thank you very much. Thanks
Thank you,
for your
Mr.
time.
Basin. Let us now invite our moderator for the session, Mr. Lee Junyu, Advisory Partner at EY.
Thank you.
Hey, Sagit.
Thank you.
Can I also invite my other two panelists?
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Hey, Willie. Max. Let's take a seat. Okay, so I think first things first, the AI-generated voice has introduced both of us, but you may be new to my two other panelists. So maybe can I invite you guys to do a self-introduction?
Hello, hi everyone. I'm Pui Lee. I'm the Senior Director overseeing the Policy and Corporate Development Cluster in the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. Very happy to be here today.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Pleasure to be here, and a great panel, great presentation earlier. My name is Max Martino, Global Head of Industrial Cybersecurity at Siemens Energy. And in simple terms, I mean, we operate about 20% of the world's energy, so responsible for securing that and beyond as well.
Right. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. So let me just dive straight in, right? Today we live in a very data-driven world, right? So I have a question for Pui Lee, right? As part of the government agency in Singapore tasked with protecting Singapore's cyberspace, are you able to share with us, right, maybe statistics of ransomware cases in Singapore, and are any of these attacks that you've seen directly on OT systems?
Thanks, Junyu, for the great question. I wanted to also echo Mac's point that it was a great presentation by Sankit. Indeed, the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore, we had released the Singapore Cyber Landscape 2022 report. This was in June earlier this year. And the report reviews our cybersecurity situation. And ransomware continues to pose a significant risk to organizations in Singapore. And the number of reported cases in 2022 was 132. This is last year, and is comparable to the 137 cases in the preceding year. And these cases mainly affected small and medium enterprises in the manufacturing as well as retail sectors. Not surprising, because many of them have valuable data as well as IP, which the cyber criminals seek to extort and monetize for gains. As to the point of whether these attacks had affected the ICS systems, I think to our knowledge, we have not had successful ransomware attacks on critical OT systems in Singapore. But I think following from Sankit's earlier presentation, I think if we look overseas, there are examples of ransomware attacks on OT systems. Besides what was mentioned by Sankit, just mentioned three examples in the US, Europe, as well as in Asia. So I think in the US, the healthcare sector, where actually according to statistics by the US Department of Health, the healthcare sector is more than 4 times more likely to be targeted by ransomware as compared to any other sector. And in 2022, there was an attack in a hospital in Iowa, which basically this was on a medical device that provided pain relief medicine to a 3-year-old child. So as a result of the attack, the child received 5 times the prescribed dosage. So one can only imagine the consequences could have been actually very severe. Thankfully, in that case, the child had recovered. So that's one example in the healthcare industry side. In Europe, also last year, there was a ransomware attack on the oil refining hub in Antwerp, Rotterdam, which had caused disruptions in terms of distribution of cargo. And very recently in July, in Japan, the port of Nagoya had also been attacked by ransomware, which had affected cargo distributions. So basically the loading and unloading of containers from ships. So it is happening. It is not, ransomware is not a matter of if, but actually when. So I think it's very imperative that OT professionals as well as cybersecurity professionals take this threat seriously.
Just to add to that, I can back that statement. In Singapore, of course, at Siemens Energy, any of our running power generators, we get notification of an unplanned outage, and there's sometimes correlation of a potential cyber threat. In Singapore, that has not happened so far. It doesn't mean it's not going to happen, but I think the regulation has a lot of things in place that, you know, mitigates it to some extent. But yes, to back your statement is true. Yeah.
True. I think testament to what CSA has done. I think a lot of the OT environments I've seen and have worked on, right, are isolated and thereby being a little bit more protected, right? But 132 reported cases, and that probably is, so maybe I should just remind everybody, that's probably the tip of the iceberg, because I'm sure a larger number of cases go unreported, right? But I'm going to ask you a very controversial question now, and open to all three of you. We have heard from yesterday's discussions, and also from Sankit's earlier presentation, right, that usually, I think to sort of use your terms, right, it's OT outage because of an IT incident, right? So, I'm quite sure most of the audience here, very, very intimately involved with OT operations, that's why they're here. Can they rest easy? Can they relax a little bit? Because it seems like it's the IT guys who need to sort of, improve their game.
Yeah. So again, I want to repeat what I presented, and thanks for the question, by the way. Great question. No one can relax in cybersecurity world. The OT and the IT, it's collaborated. For OT to work properly, to bring in automation, the reporting, the billing, IT has to be there, and it's a joint responsibility of the whole of the IT team, the enterprise IT team, to secure both the IT and the OT side. Because if you see the Purdue level or the Purdue architecture within the OT environment, there are IT machines. So obviously the responsibility is within the OT team to secure both side of it, have a proper segmentation. But yes, why IT? Like I said, it's a very easy access for the adversaries. So if you think from an adversary point of view, they need an easy access. They need an initial access to really compromise the first very system and then move laterally. And nothing like compromising the IT environment, those legacy machine, those legacy architecture, VPNs without multi-factor authentication enabled. So yeah, so that's where the IT easiness comes for the adversaries.
So what I know, so one OT outage caused by IT issues does happen, but when it comes from like the example of a cyber threat happening in IT, of course, IT getting compromised on the corporate side happens a lot, right? So it's every day pretty much, but when even that breaks out, to cause an outage on OT, like what happened in Colonial, is very, very rare, because usually there's, mitigation to be able to disconnect it to, and then audit to see if there's, if it has actually transferred to the OT environment. However, there's another version of IT causing OT outage, which is IT strategy, IT methodology, IT cybersecurity mindset coming into OT, implementing with that approach. We've had many outages. We actually, like, real cyber threat, maybe less than actual true outages caused by IT incorrect strategy, did not consider the OT processes and the priority, and had a couple plant shutdowns, cost millions of dollars, right? So multiple, actually. It happens all the time. Because they didn't like the switch, they changed the switch and wrong configuration, plant down. Or because they implemented some, one of the technologies like Dragos, Clarity, Nozomi, whichever, they implemented it, and they caused a loop on the plant and plant shutdown. And those are huge incidents caused by IT without the correct approach. So yeah, I mean, not related to ransomware or anything, but yes, that happens quite a bit, and something to consider in your approach as well, in my advice.
Really, anything to add? No, good. So thanks, Max, for that, because my next question, while it's posed to Sanket, but you gave me a very good segue into it, and also sort of corroborates what Sanket is talking about, the IT-OT convergence, right? In the OT space, right, there's a lot of cybersecurity activities that in the IT space. So in the OT space, we are slowly getting used to it, right? So Sanket, your closing statement to your presentation, right, if I were to quickly summarize, it's we can only solve the problem if we understand the problem, right? Okay, so I think in today's world, even in the OT environments, right, and I was an ex-engineer, right, with Siemens. So, so anyway, I think we have slowly come, or putting on my engineer's hat, engineers today are slowly acknowledging, right, that there are activities which has taken place, for quite a long time now in the IT space that are very good to solving, or rather identifying the problems, right? And such activities can include, say, for example, threat hunting, vulnerability assessments, penetration tests, and recently, red teaming is what red or purple teaming is one of the very hot topics. Now, however, they are still very hesitant to move forward, despite acknowledging that yes, this can give me that visibility towards my weaknesses. And that is simply because there's still this undispellable fear that while doing this, I'll bring down my entire operations, right? So maybe first to Sankit, in your opinion, do you think the benefits of such activities outweigh the risks? Right? Or if not, are there then other ways that we can achieve the same outcome of visibility of weaknesses?
Yeah, thanks. I think just to repeat the question in single line is, how do we identify a problem before we solve it in a non-disruptive way?
Yes.
Because in IT world, organizations, they are doing red team, the penetration testing, but in the OD side of the architecture, it's very mission critical. I mean, no one wants to disrupt. In my recommendation also, a pen test in a production OT environment is a no-go. Probably it would be a better idea to have a pen test in the QA test environment in the solution providers lab like Siemens lab, where you can test it before you deploy in production. But having said that, how do we really identify the key gaps, security gaps within the production environment, if not pen test? So there are many ways. I think if you remember my last slide on the recommendation is the visibility. Now, to get the visibility into the OT environment, you have network-based solution in a passive mode. I don't want to name any vendor here, no hard selling. But yeah, there are ways you can have a passive discovery of your asset mapping to the Purdue level within your architecture. That's one way of doing it. The second is to have visibility, or rather I should say do a compromise assessment than a pen test. How do you do that? You can deploy an agent-based solution. I will do a hard selling here. CrowdStrike have a good, nice EDR for OT environment where you can deploy these agent to the machines until Purdue level 3. We are getting certified with different vendor, but coming to the point, you deploy the agent start collecting the telemetry, OT-specific telemetry, and we have 24/7 hunting team looking into those event, and these hunters understand the IT/OT environment, and this is where if they find something suspicious, malicious in the telemetry, they will immediately contact you. So getting the visibility around the assets, the vulnerabilities around the legacy asset, the endpoint telemetry, the communication between the different asset within the Purdue environment, and that's where you understand. But the compromise assessment is the right way, rather than doing a pen test in the production environment.
Actually, different mindset. Operations is key. Why? Because it generates revenue, and that's the driver of the company, right? So it's a simple approach of understanding what is the risk, what is the potential cause of outage or unplanned outage, and what is the potential risk of even implementing tools that could cause an outage or the cost of that itself. So if you actually look at, making that statement towards a logical sense from a financial perspective, it comes down to, do we want to take this approach? What could the damage be? Maybe, we want to level up in our cybersecurity, or we take the risk of CSA penalties, government penalties, outage costs, etc. What's the chance of that happening? Or doing nothing, right? So put those two together, it's very easy to put the two side by side. And then you can say, okay, I need an unplanned outage just to implement cybersecurity controls or do a, active vulnerability assessment to map out, the assets. Or, plan it into a planned outage, which is usually even hard because that has other purposes. But to get that extended, there's a cost to outage, right? So yeah, the simple way I would say is look at what the risk is, what the potential loss is versus what the cost is of an outage and the investment for cyber, yeah.
So a very business-driven view.
Well, I mean, that's the truth of everybody.
Why run a power plant if you're not making money, right? Okay. So, Max, maybe more from the OT perspective now. Being in the OT line previously myself, right? I'd say that most OT organizations and the engineers, right? One of the very key things that they do during the sort of build-up of the system, the deployment of the system, and then the life cycle of the system, is to have very robust business continuity and disaster recovery plans, right? And this is to achieve operational resilience, and this is often rehearsed, practiced, or played through regularly through BCDR exercises, right? Now, many feel that the game plan for ransomware is pretty much the same, right? Which is I perform frequent backups, right? And I make sure that I'm able to restore these backups when I need to. So if that's the case, sounds pretty much straightforward, right? Because we are able to easily restore availability. So why are we so worried about ransomware?
2 or 3 things. There's actually a question on the screen that's related to this as well. But one, back to my earlier point, I get this question raised, like, why do we need any cybersecurity? Because if anything happens, we can just reset, re-image everything and get it up and running. But little do you know that that outage in itself, first of all, in their mind, maybe cost $4 million, right? Because there's a downtime. Or if you did not plan your recovery well, which is something you should test quite a lot. Backup is easy. Recovery is not as easy. And maybe look at third-party ways to have other mitigations. Then the costs could rack up. So back to that statement, what is really the chance of ransomware? And is that easier to mitigate through other solutions from it happening, or depend on your backup and take that risk of that hit maybe a couple times a year, or one time a year, or one time every 3 years? You don't know. I would say the other bit is ransomware. I mean, as people know, that's our strategy. They got smart too, our threat actors, right? So they also have gone further where they've, they sit in your environment for 6 months without letting you know, and encrypt your backups too. Backing up from a not actual image of your plant setup, or a golden image, or maybe have a physical backup that's even better, but doing it from an older state, or what you think is standard with all the changes that happened over a couple of years, is a couple of days, maybe a week. So then we're not talking about the same budget I mentioned before. So it can be very impactful, and maybe it's just easier to do what you can to reduce the chance of ransomware actually having a hit on your environment.
Yeah, I would like to add to his point. He made a very valid point. The restore usually take a longer time. Even after getting the encryption keys, paying the ransom by Colonial Pipeline, they took 5 days to restore the system. So restore, whether it is a legit restore or with a key from adversaries, it takes time. But on the other side, this question very well relates to another question, that whether to pay or not to pay. If I have a backup, I don't want to pay. Now, in the ransomware attack these days, like I explained in my presentation, it's not one extortion, double extortion, triple extortion. In double extortion, the second one is basically the data exfil. Your data is out. So these ransomware adversaries, first they compromise the machine, they go to the critical ones where the data is. Similar thing happened to Colonial Pipeline. They exfiltrate the data, and if you don't pay, then they publish the data in the dark web, they sell it. Now, the reputation loss, the data loss is another extortion technique attackers use. So it's always a question to pay or not to pay, completely a business decision, but restore is one thing, the reputation and the data loss is another thing.
So we'll come back to some of these little points that you're talking about much later on. But I think maybe I'll entertain one of these audience questions, which is, and I'll put a different slant to it, right? So the question here says, what can organizations do to foster effective collaboration and information sharing among stakeholders, bracket, government, private sector, vendors, threat intel providers, to combat ransomware threats for OT? Now, maybe before answering that question, I have a question for Pui Lee again, right? So, NDP just over, and I remember this very strong message that digital defense is now a key pillar of Singapore's total defense concept, right? So maybe can you share with us, right? So related to that audience question, what's our government and what's your agency doing to help, critical infrastructure and other companies, private sector, right, in our country to fend off ransomware attacks?
Thanks, Junyu. It's a really great question. First, I think there is no easy answer. Ransomware is very much a cross-border and cross-domain issue. I mean, you see multiple sectors which are impacted. And when we look at this problem, it is a complex ecosystem. You have ransomware actors, operators, their affiliates, also developers who offer ransomware as a service. So it's actually very vital that we address this challenge both on the domestic front within Singapore as well as on the international front, because it's a cross-boundary issue. So I think on this aspect, on the domestic front, CSA has had convened interagency task force to counter ransomware in 2022. It comprised 8 public agencies as well as organs of state. I think the discussions thus far have been focused on what enterprises can do to secure themselves against ransomware threats. But there are also other dimensions to the problem in terms of law enforcement. What do we do in terms of follow-up for victims of ransomware attacks, as well as financial regulation. Sankit's presentation talked about the very first ransomware case where it was floppy disk and you send the ransom by post. These days, with the development of cryptocurrency, actually it is instantaneous transfer of funds, large scale. So the illicit financing of ransomware is also a very important aspect that we have to address as well, so that we can break the business model of the ransomware actors. Because paying of ransoms actually fuels the industry. So there is, on the domestic front, the Counter-Ransomware Task Force had released a report last year, and this had set out 4 pillars of action in terms of how organizations can strengthen cyber defenses, which I think we have talked about. Second part was about disrupting the business model in terms of how we can stop illicit financing, and this requires coordinated efforts amongst our financial regulators. One aspect that we have been working on is together with the Financial Action Task Force, which is the global anti-money laundering and countering terrorism financing watchdog, is to implement Recommendation 15. Recommendation 15 basically requires regulations to be put in place to regulate virtual asset service providers, so that there is traceability of funds and there are controls in place because ransomware actors utilize these service providers to actually be able to transfer monies. So on the international, so that is the second aspect, disrupting the business model. And the third part is really about how do we help victims of ransomware attacks? And I think on this aspect, we are working on a resource portal where we can provide information as well as reference available resources today that have decryption keys to common ransomware strains. There is one that is available today that is called nomoreransom.org. It had been set up by Europol, so organizations can actually make reference to that. And I think last part is really working with our international partners, which CSA is part of. We are working as part of a US-led international counter-ransomware task force. And Singapore is actually the co-chair together with the UK on the policy pillar. So we look at policies in terms of how do we work on the financial regulation front. I think I will just add a last point that indeed we need to have effective collaboration amongst the ecosystem operators, whether it is government, private sector, vendors. One area that we are working on is about incident reporting. When something happens, I mentioned about the 132 reported cases. And indeed, this is really just the tip of the iceberg. But actually, with greater sharing across, we can have better situational awareness, especially if it is also international sharing of information. So governments across, as part of this International Counter-Ransomware Task Force, is working on this aspect to see how we can facilitate information sharing, including TTPs, so that actually there is greater situational awareness amongst the different ecosystem stakeholders.
I just want to add to that because that was, I love that. So the key thing is coming from, if you look at financial sector, there's a competitive advantage of not sharing information, right? So it's a different approach. In energy sector, where we have a responsibility, and we are happy to share because it benefits the world and people's lives, right? So, and it's the government. So I also highly recommend share what you see and share that experience. We do the same. We work with OTCEP, many communities actually, as well as CSA and other governments, and we know they co-share as well amongst each other. And that's a really rich approach. I would say the only thing I have seen, because we do see incidents where we've been asked not to share, even to some extent to what actually happened anonymously, which is in Asia specifically, is loss of face. But if you can let that go, no, I mean, it's the government related sometimes too. If you can let that go, sharing that information actually helps, society in the end. And that's a different mindset if you look at financial sector where there's a competitive advantage because now I know and they might get hit, and
That's a very good point. Asian or not, okay? However, something Pueli said earlier on, it got stuck in my head, right? Which is that paying ransom fuels the industry. And so you see, cyber insurance is a very, very hot topic at boardrooms today, right? Everybody's talking about cyber insurance, and cyber insurers, they offer coverage for, first, loss of revenue, right? Good. Cost of recovery, even better. But the third whammy is they'll pay for the ransom, right? And hearing what you said, so maybe this is a discussion for all. What are your views, right? Has cyber insurance become mandatory? And yet, it seems contradictory, right? That when I get the insurance and the insurer helps me pay the ransom, we are fueling that industry.
Yeah, indeed. I think we see cyber insurance as a useful risk management tool for organizations, because exactly as what you mentioned, you can use that to manage and transfer your risks together with the cyber insurance providers. But I think the issue is also, it then relates to the scope of coverage of the insurance policies. And specifically, there are some policies that cover payment of ransom. I think this policy was discussed amongst the Interagency Counter-Ransomware Task Force. And the sense is really that paying the ransom does not guarantee that you will get the decryption for your data. It does not guarantee that the data will not be published, and it does not guarantee that the data that is exfiltrated will not be released. So I think at the same time, when you pay the ransom for the company, there is also a concern that actually the company becomes a soft target. So you pay once, and I come back again. And I think the third point is that paying the ransom fuels the industry, and it is an industry because today ransomware is offered as a service, and the money is a very important aspect of this. And therefore, the Interagency Counter-Ransomware Task Force has recommended that we strongly discourage the payment of ransoms. And this is really trying to address this problem at its core in terms of disrupting the business model, encouraging organizations to take proactive steps to strengthen their cyber defense, and at the same time also helping victims of ransomware attacks so that they can recover their operations in the fastest time possible, including having backup data. So it is not an easy situation, but I think we believe that this is important that together, if also with our international counterparts and partners, that actually we can try to address this problem collectively and at scale so that we can have an impact overall.
I would like to add to her point. I mean, she covered it very, very well. A couple of things on. I'm personally a big believer of insurance, whether it's a life insurance, auto insurance, including cyber insurance. I mean, you raised a very good point. Or should this be mandated? Now, look at the auto industry. Why the insurance for auto industry is 20 times bigger than cyber insurance, simply because it has been mandated. You can't drive if you don't have an insurance. I firmly believe that this should happen in the cyber world also. The simple reason is you're right in a way that having an insurance is a bit peace of mind, and also having an insurance, attacker also knows that there is an insurance. They will find a social engineering that there is an insurance, and that company becomes a soft target. But the insurance underwriters, they take risk into consideration when they really provide an insurance and the scope and the coverage of insurance. So insurance doesn't mean that you sit back, relax, don't look at the risk, no, don't have visibility, don't fix the issues because there is an insurance provider. No, use the insurance provider wisely. One is understanding the risk, share with them your strategy, they can do the recommendation, and not only during the payment, they can help during the negotiation. I mean, the ransomware negotiation, post-ransomware is not a easy task. They sometimes helps to develop the IR plan. You can discuss with the provider, the underwriters, the IR plan. So there are many pros of having a cyber insurance. Obviously, it will fuel the money into the wrong hands, but it will also help to mitigate the risk.
Maybe more of a true active thing. So for the plant operators, especially critical infrastructure, check what your policy is, because no insurer is going to tell you we will, in case of outage during a ransomware, we will cover the outage starting straight away. It's 4 hours after, and it's a high cost because they cannot cover the cost of a true critical infrastructure, one, the penalties and the operational costs. So there's not a lot of cyber insurance when you're talking about true, huge, dependent critical infrastructure. I would say the other one, 100% is going to be, it's always, every time when you're operating a plant and your number one priority is to maintain operations and you're confronted with a ransomware, I would say never pay, because you could become a bigger target. The problems get bigger after, but she's absolutely 100% right. It's the hardest choice you're going to have to make, but yeah, if you do pay because it's an easier route out, it actually becomes the hardest future. So I would say, yeah.
So we did cover the fact that even the multi-agency task force, right, recommends that, or rather strongly discourages payment of ransom, right, and that's to prevent the fueling of that industry, right, and we do know where the money could possibly go, right? So we talked about money laundering, we talked about maybe perhaps funding more nefarious acts, right? However, and there's a question from the audience as well, is it really always that simple and straightforward? Are there other deeper considerations or what are actual words? Challenges and considerations when deciding whether to pay the ransom or not, right? In an OT or ICS context, are there legal ramifications? Anyone?
I think I have given my perspective before. If anyone else.
So Daniel, paying the ransom, it's not illegal in Singapore. I think the challenges and considerations, I think we have touched upon them. I think for organization, it is really, I think, understanding the cyber attack, I mean the ransomware attack that has happened, and then balancing and considering whether you are able to recover. I would add that I think one consideration as we think about cyber crime in the physical world, for example, if you take the kidnapping, and when a kidnapper has caught someone and he extorts and makes the ransom request, victim reports to the police. In some situations, you actually have the police undertakes a negotiation with the kidnapper. And the idea there is not so much that they have already decided, I'm going to pay the ransom. But it is that actually you are trying to also buy time to gather more information about who's the bad guy and be able to formulate your response plan and to see how you can save the victim. So I think it is really part of an overall plan, which I think is useful for organizations to consider, to have in place, should one day the attack come, that actually you are prepared in terms of the response. Because I think that is a critical determinant of then how well you can respond, I think, in a situation, when the situation happens. Because during that time is of the factor. You probably don't have time to think through, come up with considerations and challenges. But when you have worked out a plan, you have thought about what are the different considerations and what is your approach, I think, to dealing with the attack, then actually when the attack happens, actually you have something that is ready to go in terms of response.
Very true point. I have something, so ransomware does not mean it equates to pay Bitcoin, right? Not necessarily, most of the time it does. In my past, and this is quite shocking, actually critical infrastructure because it's considered healthcare. In Singapore, I got a call from an environment that got ransomware, and they actually got contacted by the threat actor and said, if you can pass this to 2 other sites, actually pinpointed relationships of that person, is very targeted, then we will give you the decryption. That's shocking, right?
Wow.
But what do? It's inhumane. Save yourself and let others. Actually, CSA was contacted at the time. We looked at into a response plan, and because of the contacting of the sites, it allowed us to investigate the attacker, or allowed CSA to investigate the attacker, and actually do further investigation. In the end, it didn't have much impact, but that's shocking to the extent and the benefit of having a proper approach and plan in place to even deal with those really challenging, confrontations, I would say.
Max, perfect lead into my next question. Okay, so I think all the OT folks here know, right? We rely very, very heavily on our system integrators or on the OEMs, right, such as yourself. And we often sign very long-standing maintenance contracts. So sometimes in the process of trying to uplift their own cybersecurity postures, they fear that something happens to the support from the OEMs, right? So again, I know you can only represent Siemens Energy, right? However, maybe just hearing from you to get a feel, sort of across all the larger OT suppliers, how are OEMs supporting clients in this never-ending war from the perspective of protect, detect, perhaps respond, and then recover?
I also deal with this challenge within Siemens Energy, right? So we have our control systems, and are kind of under a service contract, we give guarantees for operational side and limited downtime, and we're actually liable to a lot of extent, actually most extent as well, which means if anything compromises that risk, including cyber attacks, but also including cyber defense implementation on the control itself, that then takes away, either costs us a lot of money to resolve. As mentioned, a lot of outages happen with implementation of these kind of things. But it's also our responsibility if something does go wrong. Now, of course, financially, that's fine, but there is a risk to the nation or critical infrastructure from that side. So I'd love to do anything. The problem is we need to be sure it does not impact operations, right? That's the key aspect. And that's where the OEMs know. If it's not under a service contract, you're free to do whatever you want. I would still recommend to check it with the OEM because it will cost you a lot of money anyways, then it's your responsibility. However, there's a lot of other things you can do as well. So the only OEM true, kind of void of service and liability is when it sits on the controls, when it touches the system, in the network, in your IT/OT convergence, in your intelligence, in your relationship with CSA, or your incident response plan, your readiness, your backup and recovery. All of that does not touch the controls. It's outside. Do you still want advice? Yes, because a lot of these things can produce a lot of noise that doesn't have value and you get confused. And the OEM knows what it does mean. So there is a lot you can do, but yes, there's a challenge. Now, there are certain innovations and there's certain risks you can take as well to breach that contract or maybe agree to breach that contract on a certain aspect where you can implement controls. It could take years to actually get that approved, but there might be, some nuances here and there. But I would say it's all about maintaining operations. And if we provide the guarantee as an OEM, we have the liability if, other people want to breach it, like IT companies coming in and doing EDR that actually blocks a process that's critical to operations. That happens quite a lot, and that's a huge risk, almost bigger than cyber itself.
Yeah, that's where, OEMs like CrowdStrike, Siemens, we are kind of collaborating in a way that you need a technology to prevent, but like he said, you also need to make sure that technology doesn't bring the system down. We do a lot of testing together. As we talk currently, we are testing our solution with Siemens so that we make sure that customers should deploy CrowdStrike to mitigate the risk, and we make sure that it doesn't disrupt the business. So yeah.
Wait, so you and Siemens are working together. Is there a reason why you're on the same panel?
Siemens Energy is a different company from Siemens. But
So, Preely, what about from the government front? Is there something that we're doing to help this scene?
Yeah. So I think besides what I had mentioned just now, I think on this front is really also, I think in the ransomware reported cases that CSA sees, I think what we see is also actually having good cybersecurity practices is really very essential. And I think to that we have implemented a SG Cyber Safe program for companies. And under this program, we have informational toolkits that actually provide information about what the different groups within the company need to understand about cybersecurity. As well as we have also launched the Cyber Essentials and Trust Marks to help organizations think about, where their assets are, how do they go about securing and protecting them, ensuring that they have software updates. I think given the point that with in the OT environment there is greater convergence with IT, actually it's very important to get the basics right. And therefore, I think government is playing this facilitator role, working and enabling, I think, organizations to be able to take and improve their cybersecurity posture in response to this ransomware threat environment.
And also to complement that, thank you, CSA. CCOP 2.0 is great. And also that we cannot live without complying, right? We have to provide the capability to meet that requirement. But the more regulations, the more enablement and the more enforcement is to drive that innovation within the OEMs, also to build up that resilience beyond what's required, but at least have the requirement and the mandate and that visibility within the OEMs. It helps me a lot too, so thank you.
So unfortunately, I think we have reached the end of the allocated time to us. I personally had a very enlightening time. I hope it was the same for all you guys here, right? Because I had one technologist, one OEM, and a spokesperson from the government, right? So I think it gave a very balanced view, and I learned a lot from them. So please, let's give my panelists a round of applause.